Okay, Daniel 4. Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. The chapter 4 of the book of Daniel is sandwiched between a declaration of God's glory at the beginning and a declaration of God's glory at the end. It seems as if the chapter as a whole is a decree, that it is a decree that was given out to the people by Nebuchadnezzar, and the opening of it, in a sense, makes no sense immediately after chapter 3 until you see what follows it. We have had already in Daniel two major signs and wonders. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Nobody can interpret the dream, so he's about to kill off all the magicians and wise men, the magi of the Babylonian Empire, until Daniel comes along. God reveals to him not only the interpretation, but the dream itself, so that Daniel can say, this is what you dreamed, this is the interpretation. And the interpretation of the dream was that the statue that he saw represented various different kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, but then after him was going to come the silver and the bronze and the iron and clay. That there would be other kingdoms after him. But most importantly of all, that there would be a stone that came afterwards, striking the feet, damaging and destroying all residue of the original statue, and that this stone would become a mountain that would fill the whole earth. And as Daniel explained to Nebuchadnezzar, there was a king coming that was going to surpass all the other kings, whose kingdom would conquer the entire world, that would smash apart any residue, leftovers, effect of previous kingdoms, and a kingdom that would last forever. That God, the God of Daniel, was going to have his king in the end. Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of chapter 2, speaks out and says, man, Daniel, what you've done in revealing this dream, this is amazing. Your God's the best God. Go Yahweh. Hashtag Team Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar is saying good things about the Jewish God. But what is clear is that Nebuchadnezzar had adopted Yahweh to his pantheon of polytheistic worship. That he had these other gods. They had the gods of Babylon, Nebu, Bel, Marduk, and all the others, and they had these gods that they worshipped, and now Yahweh has earned his place amongst them. The two things are problematic as we go into chapter 3. As we go into chapter 3, the two problems are the two things that are unresolved. Number one, what is unresolved is that Yahweh still doesn't have his proper place. And secondly, because he doesn't have his proper place in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, Nebuchadnezzar's pride continues to rise up. And so we find in chapter 3 another image. The same word is used in chapter 2 as in chapter 3. And this image is purely of gold. The Nebuchadnezzar, who was the head of gold, now has an image that is entirely gold. But Nebuchadnezzar can't see beyond his own big head. Whether the image was literally an image of him, whether it was simply an obelisk with all the accomplishments that he'd done upon it, we don't know for sure, but we do know that it represents him. And then we saw in chapter 3 the last couple of weeks, that they were all the government officials, the federal workers, if you want to put it in modern parlance, they all were commanded to bow down before this image as they're showing their allegiance to Caesar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't prepared to do that, and so they were, before they were cast into the furnace, they were given a chance to recant. Their compliance was what was necessary. we didn't want them being dissenters. But they wouldn't. They wouldn't comply. And so they got thrown into the fiery furnace. We saw Jesus almost certainly being the one there in the midst with them. And we see them being preserved from the fiery furnace. And we see Nebuchadnezzar ending chapter 3, once again giving glory to Yahweh. But again, in a polytheistic sense. There's a lesson to be learned as we come to chapter 4, and it's a very important one. And that is that people can hear about God, people can witness things that God does, his majesty and his greatness, and they can attribute to him some degree of praise. But unless they bow the knee, unless they repent and turn from the worship of idols, there's no salvation. There are so many people today who say, oh, I'm okay with Jesus. Yeah, I like, oh, you're into Jesus. Oh, I like Jesus. Liking Jesus will accomplish nothing other than greater judgment for not responding to the greater light that you've been shown. It is not enough to like him. It is not enough to think that he's okay. It's not enough to simply go to church here and there. It's not enough to simply have a Bible that you read occasionally. But turning to Christ, responding to his gospel, involves turning from sin and bowing the knee before him and him alone. We cannot be unclear about these things, friends. Some of you may have come across in the last week the very interesting and many times entertaining interview that the Babylon Bee did with Elon Musk, where they bumbled along and it was fun and it was insightful. And then at the end they said, well, you know, we are a Christian group, let's try and share the gospel. And it was the equivalent of, and pardon me for an English sport analogy, having an open goal, the goalie's on the floor, or he's gone off somewhere else, and it's just you and the goal 2 feet in front of you, and somehow you kick it wide, or you kick it over. We must not fumble the gospel. There are too many Christians who come across Nebuchadnezzars who say a few positive things about Jesus, and we give them assurance of salvation when they should have none. If Nebuchadnezzar was saved in chapter 2, he wouldn't have built the statue in chapter 3. So when we come to chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar now says, I'm making a decree, essentially, all peoples, nations, languages, that repetition. He's telling everybody who's in his kingdom, wherever they've come from, all that dwell in the earth. He's the one who has rule over pretty much anything he wants on the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. It seems good to me to show, in other words, speak of, let you know, tell about, the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done. That expression is lovely. God is the Most High. What does it mean, Most High? Height is like heaven. Heaven is high. Heaven is in the heights, right? They saw heaven as being high up. We'll see that connection a little bit later on. So the Most High means he is the highest of them all. The Jews understood better than we do, and the ancient people, even the Babylonians, understood better than we do, that there is this realm of heaven, and there are in the heavens the heavenly beings, angels and demons, as we would call them. They would have simply referred to them as gods. But amongst those pantheon of gods, of angelic beings, amongst the creatures that are of another realm, there is one who is the only one who is the creator of all the others. There is one who is Elohim, and the Elohim Most High. He is the one that you distinguish from the other Elohim simply by calling him Elohim. He is the one true God amongst the other gods with little g's. And so there seems to be a recognition here by Nebuchadnezzar of who God is. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. And in that second half of that verse, we have the clear indication that Nebuchadnezzar has learned his lesson. Because there was the head of gold that became the statue of gold. And so when Nebuchadnezzar had a miracle, a sign done for him, God in heaven revealed to a pagan king in a dream the history, the future history of the world, and gave it to him as a gift. Can you imagine that privilege? He's a pagan king, and God says, I'm going to tell you stuff about the future of the world that I've not told anybody else to this point. What a privilege and an honor. And what was the point of that dream? What was the point of that story when he finally gets his interpretation? The point is the stone that becomes a mountain at the end. What was Nebuchadnezzar's takeaway? I'm a head of gold. Right? That was what he took from it. A narcissistic interpretation of Scripture. Narcissism, as we call it. The Bible was all about him, you know. So now he seems to have learned. Now when he says, your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, your dominion, that is the power and the authority that you have, endures from generation to generation. So there's two distinct things there. Thing number one is that your kingdom is the kingdom that's going to last forever. That's the stone, that's the mountain, not me, not who I am. You're the one who has the great kingdom that will last forever. But secondly, you currently have authority that will continue from generation to generation. That your authority is the authority that's put me in power. Your authority is the authority that puts the next kingdom in power, and so on and so forth, until your king comes and he reigns throughout the earth forever and ever. Amen. That's what he has finally realized. So what is it that brought about the change? Having a dream and not telling anybody that dream, and having someone come and tell him the dream that he only knew in his own head, and then interpret that dream, that wasn't enough to get him to bow the knee. Then to throw people alive into a fiery furnace, and for them to be met by the living God in the fiery furnace, and to come out unburnt, without a hair on their head singed, that wasn't enough for him to bow the knee. So what was it that was enough? Let's have a look. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I'm going to stop there for a minute. I want to do this quickly because I want to whiz through a whole bunch of this, but I want us to know a little bit about his palace. We know that Nebuchadnezzar is big on bragging. We're going to see it a little bit later on. And in fact, we have historical records from archaeologists with literally writings of Nebuchadnezzar, and the topic that he wrote on was how wonderful Nebuchadnezzar was. Seems to be his favorite topic. So Nebuchadnezzar is telling everybody how great he is and what he's accomplished, and we know a whole bit about Babylon. In Babylon, there was this city, and it was about 15 miles squared. Can you imagine that? A city that's 15 miles in one direction and 15 miles in the other. It has two sets of walls, an outer wall and then another separate inner wall. The outer wall was 350 feet high. Remember last week we were talking about the statue being 90 feet high? 350 feet high. Pretty much like almost small skyscraper heights. I mean, just ridiculous. And it was so wide on the top that there were 4 chariots could ride abreast of one another. That's like a freeway, guys. Or at least like Glen Oaks. Maybe I'm getting a bit beyond myself, but you know what I mean. 4 chariots side by side on top going around the walls. Going in, there are these massive streets. There are what we would call highways, just these huge paved streets leading to various things. 12 gates around the city walls. There were 1.2 million people who lived there. This was huge. There were 50 different temples to the various gods that the Babylonians worshipped. And the highlight of it all was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. that he made for one of his wives to remind her of home. So when it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace, oh yeah, he was. The palace was an absolute centerpiece within this astonishing city. As I lay in bed, the fancies and visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Kind of a bit of a deja vu here, aren't we? We're back to chapter 2. Call in the wise men, I've got a dream. The dream troubles him. Well, last time the dream troubled him, this time it alarms him. The words are kind of getting a little stronger now. He is scared of this dream. He is scared of this dream. And notice that he makes a decree that the wise men should come. He doesn't just call them. That's what happened in chapter 2. We're escalating again now in that he makes a decree. You have to come, whether you like it or not. So the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream. Now, these people are different people now. I mean, they're the same physical, flesh and bones, but they are different people. They are now under the headship of Daniel, who runs that school. Daniel who helps them. Daniel who leads them. Daniel who teaches them. And that's going to be something that's going to be relevant. Because it says, I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me the interpretation. Now, the way that this is worded in the original can actually have two meanings. Number one is that they were not able to interpret the dream. He's told us the dream. I've got no idea what that means. That's one possible interpretation. And that's how you'll typically read it in English. But the other possible interpretation is that they weren't willing to interpret the dream. Now, I've wrestled with this a little bit, and I tentatively lean towards the second interpretation for several reasons. Firstly, they are now schooled by Daniel, and I suspect that they're better than they were, and they're leaning on the Lord. Secondly, Daniel, when he does come and interpret the dream in a moment, he's not very keen on giving him the interpretation either. And I suspect that because Nebuchadnezzar was afraid, and because Nebuchadnezzar decrees, that Nebuchadnezzar had a sneaking suspicion what this dream was about as well. So let's keep moving. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belshazzar after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. It's an interesting little aside here. Daniel, we know, has been given the name Belshazzar. It's interesting he refers to him by both names, so all would know him. And from his perspective at this point, and this phrase is going to come up 3 times, in Daniel is the spirit of the holy gods. I wouldn't read too much into this. Some versions traditionally have rendered it a spirit of the holy God, singular. That's not what the text says. It's spirit of the holy gods, plural, polytheistic people. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar understood about the Holy Spirit indwelling Daniel, which Daniel as a prophet almost certainly did have. I think that this is probably, my best understanding, an idiomatic expression of that time, just simply shorthand for the gods speak to Daniel. Daniel has a connection with the heavens. The Elohim and Daniel, they're kind of tight sort of thing. That's what's being said here. It's possible that Nebuchadnezzar is giving his view of Daniel prior to his conversion, but I think that because we begin with the words of Nebuchadnezzar after his conversion, when he truly has bowed the knee before God, I suspect that this as an entirety is the story and the decree that Nebuchadnezzar tells. He says at the beginning, I want to show you the signs and wonders. Well, that's what he's doing. He's showing us in this chapter. So I suspect that this expression is simply an idiomatic expression, meaning that Daniel gets to know things from God that other people don't get to know. So I wouldn't read too much into that. So he tells him the dream, saying, "O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians," there's the reminder that Daniel's in charge of them all, "because I know that the spirit of the holy gods," there's that expression again, "is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these." See, no trickery this time, just tell me straight. "I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the great earth. Its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven. And it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heaven lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it." Now, I had to make decisions in preparing today as to how many weeks to spread this chapter and how much time to take on this. So I'm just going to give you a couple of little nudges, and we tonight at the evening service at 6:30, we can follow through some of these. Most weeks now, people are saying, "Can you just follow up on that rabbit trail?" And we tend to go down these directions. But there are connections here to many different passages. The first one I think becomes evident is that Jesus eventually tells a parable about a tree that grows big and fills the whole earth, and that there are birds that come and nest in it. So there's a link to the parables, and I suspect that Jesus is to some degree referencing back to this. So that's maybe a rabbit trail we can go down tonight. But for now, there is a tree. It is huge. It grows. It reaches to the heaven. And the whole earth can see it. Now, however you picture that, is up to you. To what degree you consider the height that would reach the heavens, to whatever degree you consider the whole earth, is really by the by. I think we get the gist of the picture. The only other little intertextual connection that we should note here is that the reaching of the heavens is something that we have a little bit of history with in the Bible. Remember Tower of Babel? Tower of Babel was a tower that was intending to reach to the heavens. Now, if your only interaction with the Tower of Babel is from children's storybook Bibles, then you're going to think that they were somehow naive and they literally thought that they could just build up and build up and build up and eventually they would reach God. It's not the case at all. But rather, the Tower of Babel was similar to a Babylonian ziggurat. It was a very high temple of worship. And the purpose of it was to reach the gods. To reach the gods. That the sons of God, Genesis chapter 6, looked down, saw the daughters of men, saw they were beautiful, and that's how the Nephilim came about. That's Genesis 6. And what happens in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel is that the people who have now survived the flood are returning to the same sin that caused the flood, which is we want a connection with the angelic realm. We want to reach up to these people. And there is archaeological evidence showing multiple religions of that era, of that time, having these temples that would have these cultic prostitution / worship. There were in some of these temples that have been discovered, and there are ruins of 30-feet beds that were kind of ritual beds for kind of sexual worship, where angelic beings would come and they would have, intercourse with human people, and they were essentially creating Nephilim again. Now, a lot of Christians get confused by this because they think, well, didn't the flood get rid of them all? But Genesis 6 specifically says at this time and also afterwards. So why is it that the spread didn't happen like before the flood? Because this time God, who said he won't flood the world again, at the Tower of Babel, comes and he confuses their languages, separates them into various nations, and rather than the Nephilim spreading throughout the world evenly, there's now a situation where if your tribe has Nephilim, you are now at an advantage. And we see in Genesis 14, as this story develops, the waging of war between the various tribes, where tribes are trying to kill out the tribes that have the Nephilim. In the same way, I always use the example of how in England we don't have bears and we don't have wolves, though we did for many, many centuries. Why don't we have those creatures anymore? Because they ate sheep. and so we killed them. Simple as that. The tribe that has the Nephilim is the threat. You take them out. And that's what happened. So when I see an expression that alludes back to Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel reaching to the heavens, then I think we need to understand that there is an implication that this tree was seeking the realm of the gods. That's the implication of the text. Does that mean that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to replicate the sin of Babel? That he was seeking help from the gods? Maybe not in the same way, but certainly to some degree. This is a city that had 50 different temples. Who's going to help give us victory? This god, or this god? Well, let's just have them all. The gods will give us victory over the weaker gods of the other nations. That was their understanding. So absolutely crucial to us understanding this vision is that the tree is seeking help from the heavenly realms. Verse 13. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. If you weren't convinced by my link to the Tower of Babel, to the Nephilim, to the sons of God coming down, then I hope that this makes it clear. The term here, the watcher, is a term that is repeatedly used in the extra biblical book, the non-canonical book, the Book of Enoch, which talks in a lot of detail. We don't know if it's true, it's not in the Bible, but it talks in a lot of detail about the Genesis 6 account. And it refers to the sons of God, the angelic beings of Genesis 6. It refers to them as watchers. They were the angelic beings who looked down on the daughters of men. They are the watchers. And that was the expression that many of these other religions would use of those people. And that is exactly the term that is used in the Aramaic here. That the watcher. And so there is irony here. There is irony in that the tree is seeking to go to the heavenly realms, and there is a watcher who then comes down from the heavenly realms. Sometimes people want the heavenly realms, and sometimes they get what they want, and it's not what they want. If you know what I mean. Sometimes people are saying, oh, if I could have this, if I could have that. And sometimes they plead for things that they're given, and it's not what they want. And here, Nebuchadnezzar, who is the tree, as we shall see, he is seeking the things of heaven. He's seeking, reaching out to the gods, perhaps. And a watcher comes down, and suddenly he won't be wanting to seek the heavens anymore, because he proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound by a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers, a decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives to it whom he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. Okay, lots of things here. Firstly, the tree is going to be chopped down. That's the decree of the watchers. The angelic beings have determined, they have decided that the tree is going to be chopped down. With the chopping down of the tree, what is that doing? The chopping down of the tree means that no longer will the tree be able to provide and oversee the birds and the beasts. But rather than that, the tree itself will become lower than the beasts. That the beasts down in the grass are overshadowed by the tree, but now the tree is chopped down and there is a stump. It's chopped down, there is a stump. And the stump is down there in the dew of the grass like the beasts. That the one who was over the beast now becomes down on the level of the beasts. Notice the iron and the brass. The stump is protected. It is not simply that this tree is chopped down and rooted out and there is no longer a tree. Oh no, there is still a tree, but there's just a stump left. Most definitively and most deliberately, the tree is not destroyed. It is stripped of its glory, it is stripped of its might, it is stripped of its magnificence, but it remains in the form of a stump. And that stump must be protected. That's very clear in the text. And let his mind, and here's a clue as to the interpretation early, be changed from a man's to a beast. So the tree is a man, and the man's mind is going to become a beast's mind. He won't just be made low like the beast, but he will have a mind like the beast. And this will last for a period of 7 periods of time, which is 7 years. The sentence is given, as we said, by the holy ones, and there's a purpose for this decree. Oh, and by the way, the decree is given, we're told, and notice that that is a repeat of the decree that Nebuchadnezzar makes. It's a repeat of the same word. Nebuchadnezzar says, I make a decree, you've all got to come and tell me the dream. And in the dream, there is a decree made. Why is that repeated? What's the connection? The connection is Nebuchadnezzar can make a decree. He has authority in that realm. But there are others outside that realm that can make a decree that lowers Nebuchadnezzar. He is not the top dog. There are those who are above him, even other created beings. And the purpose of this decree is this: to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills and sets it over the lowliest of men. I don't think lowliest of men here is talking about God setting a kingdom over Nebuchadnezzar at the end. I think it's a reminder, you think, Mr. Gold, that you are the greatest of all. You're just a man. You're just a man. And you are low. He didn't get made the lowliest of men. He already was. He was just reminded of that. And here it is, that the purpose of all that is going to occur is so that God would be glorified and people would know who he is. Sometimes terrible things happen, and everything happens ultimately for the glory of God. This dream I, Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able, or perhaps not willing, to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, and here's the third repetition of that phrase, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. It is recognized that Daniel has a connection with the heavenly realm. He sees things that others don't see, and so he is the one who is going to be able to interpret, and thus he does. Verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while. Do you see that? That's interesting. Dismayed because he doesn't know? I suspect not. I suspect dismayed because he does know. And his thoughts alarmed him. Yeah. Last time you got away with telling the king that his kingdom wouldn't last forever and there'd be other kingdoms and there was a God greater than him. Phew! Got away with that and you survived. Now you got to tell him something far worse, as we'll see. So he says, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. It's kind of like the angels fear not, isn't it? You know, when the angels say fear not, why do they say fear not? Because there's a great freaking angel with probably a huge sword towering over you. It's not like some little cherub with wings going, hello. You know, it's like this huge angel and you're like, oh my goodness, what is this otherworldly being that's come before me? And the first thing you want to do is, you know, just fall apart and empty your bowels or whatever else, you know. So the angel has to say, fear not. And in the same way, Daniel here is saying, don't let this alarm you, which, as a saying, should alarm you. It's like if I come home and if my wife were to say, now Anthony, don't worry, but there's some news. The first thing I'm going to do is, okay, this isn't good. I'm going to worry. So that's what's going on here. Belshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. That is a well-known Jewish idiom. It doesn't mean, hey, let's pray and hope that what God has said will pass won't pass, and that instead it will pass on somebody else. That's not what he's saying. This is a polite way of using a Jewish idiom to kind of say, man, this is the kind of thing that you'd wish upon your enemies and not upon yourself. But here it is anyway. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached heaven, was visible to the ends of the earth, whose leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field found shade, and whose branches the birds of heaven lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. In other words, the tree, just like with the head in chapter 2, here the entirety of the tree is Nebuchadnezzar. And this is, again, nudge number 2, to be careful what you wish for. Nebuchadnezzar, there was a dream that God gave, and it was partly about him. He was the head of gold. What does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, no, it's all about me, and he makes an image of God. So it's as if God says, you wanted a dream all about you? Okay, we'll give you one all about you. You're the tree. And your greatness has grown and reaches to the heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. We saw earlier on at the beginning of Daniel 1 that Nebuchadnezzar was given authority to take pretty much anything he wanted. That God allowed him to conquer whatever lands he wanted to conquer, and it became his. His was a kingdom that was great. And I told you a bit about the city of Babylon at that time, but this is the greatest earthly kingdom, humanly speaking, that the world had ever seen. And that is what the tree represents. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. Here we go. It is a decree of the Most High. Notice how Daniel uses the expression Most High in the telling of the story, which is where Nebuchadnezzar gets this very Jewish terminology from that he uses at the beginning of the book when he announces that the story is coming. It's a decree of the Most High. Daniel's making his point that, yeah, you've got lots of gods, but my God, as I told you previously, is the highest of all of them all. He is the Most High. It's a decree, repetition for the 3rd time, that has come upon my Lord the King. I love the wording here. Daniel is saying, you're my boss, you're my king, you have authority over me. But my Lord, capital L, my King of Kings, the Most High, he has authority over you. And while you can make a decree for me to come and give you an answer, he has given you a decree. You see that connection? So much about the whole way that the authority structure works, but you've had that for months and months, so we'll pass that over, but you understand what is going on here. The Most High, he rules the kingdom of men. Oh, sorry, no, back to verse 24. The Most High, which has come upon my Lord the King, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. I think Daniel knew the interpretation from the beginning. I think those he was training knew the interpretation from the beginning. And let's face it, it was a little bit cryptic, but it wasn't hugely difficult. I suspect Nebuchadnezzar had a good inkling of what it meant from the beginning. And Daniel is now being the brave person who has to give the one who wields the sword the worst of news. You are going to become like a beast. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. You shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you till you know that the Most High, 3rd repetition again, rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. We've learned this so thoroughly with our Caesar in the Church series. All authority is God's. He gives it to whom he wills. Why did Nebuchadnezzar have any authority? God gave it to him. So who should Nebuchadnezzar obey? God. Why? Because he can take it away just as easily. Christians, we must not at this time hide in the shadows. We must declare to Caesar that God has all authority, and he gives it to whom he wishes, and he takes it away from whom he wishes. And I think that goes for the rulers of nations. It goes to the rulers of states. It goes to the rulers of cities. It goes to policemen with authority. It goes to judges who exercise authority. It goes to the CEOs of big tech companies who have as more power and authority than many of those rulers of nations. It goes to all of them. You have what you have because of God. And I pray he makes stumps of a few more of them. And it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree. And as it was commanded to leave the stumps of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you for the time that you know that heaven rules. In other words, your kingdom will still be there for that time, but you're going to have a time out. The kingdom, your kingdom, that keeps existing, but his kingdom isn't the tree, you are the tree. And you are being chopped down. The kingdom will be kept until the time that you get to acknowledge who God is and you know that heaven rules. You may be the big kingpin, the top dog here on earth, but there are rulers in heaven that are above you. And just one common angel, just a watcher, can come and say, hey, pal, I'm chopping this tree down. There is, by the way, a humiliation perhaps better, in the watcher being involved. It's not God who chops the tree down, it's just a common angel. That in that realm, there are those who are way above you. You need to learn your place, Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. You know how sometimes you pray for a miracle for someone who's sick to be healed, and their case gets worse and their case gets worse, and then finally you'd say, Lord, you stop praying for healing, in that sense at least, and you say, Lord, just take them home to be with you. May their passing be peaceful. Your prayer shifts when the end draws nigh. For Daniel, it's the same here. The prayer he has for Nebuchadnezzar is not a prayer that this would pass. There will be no miraculous turning. It has been decreed. Nebuchadnezzar made his decree. The watchers have made a decree. God has made a decree. It is going to happen. This will happen. What can I do to stop this? Nothing you can do to stop this. It's a decree. It's going to happen. Some of us spend our lives, we devote our time, our energy, our very being to trying to change the decrees of God. Listen, I'm all for you making the best of your lives. I'm all for you investing. I'm all for 5-year plans. I'm all for having dreams and hopes and goals and trying to accomplish them. I'm all for that. But man makes his plans, but God directs his steps. And when God makes decrees on your life that you don't like, sometimes you've got to just suck it up and accept that God's plans aren't our plans. The success you craved, you may not get. The people you wanted, you may not have. The things you were chasing, you may never get. It is not our job to be successful, to meet our goals. It's our job to be faithful before the one who decrees our steps. There's such a lesson to learn there. Men especially, you who would seek the best for yourself and your family, don't waste your life chasing things that God never had for you. Seek his will above all else. Daniel says, do what's right, leave your sin behind. Show mercy to those you haven't shown mercy to. And then perhaps, not guaranteed, perhaps there'll be a lengthening of your prosperity. Just as the event is decreed, the time is decreed. And there will be an ending of it. Maybe then, after that, there will be a lengthening of the prosperity. Verse 28, all this came on Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, you kind of wonder who was talking. Is this not the great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? Imagine the scene. The palace is probably somewhere in the center of the city, 15 square miles. I'm not quite sure how far away 15 miles are, but you know, I often do my runs and hikes up on the Verdugo Mountains, and I can look down over Griffith Park, look down over that big mast where the Hollywood sign is. I can look down over downtown LA. I can look down over the river. I can see the 5 freeway, and I can sometimes see the ocean on a clear day. Nebuchadnezzar is on top of a palace, and he's looking for sort of about 7 miles all around him to these 350 feet walls of this magnificent city that the earth had never seen anything like it. That those of you who've been to London and to New York, those of you who've seen St. Paul's Cathedral, those of you who've been to New York and seen those crazy, super high, thin skyscrapers that they're making, those of you who've been to Rome and seen the wreckage of the Colosseum and the ruins there, those of you who've been to all of these amazing places, if you could walk into Babylon today, your jaw would drop, because there's nothing that you would have seen ever like it in your life. And he looked out over it all. And there is nothing wrong with being that successful. But he looked out and he said, how great I am. When the only response that would have been adequate would have been, how great thou art. And right there, in that moment, while the words were still in the king's mouth. How specific is that for you? Can you imagine this? This king, this majestic great man says, for the glory of my majesty, and his brain fails. He becomes like an animal. The text tells us what happens. There fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe his brain functions for a little bit longer for him to hear this cry. Heaven, where the tree was trying to reach, is where the voice comes from. O Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you. You shall be driven from among men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And immediately the word was filled against Nebuchadnezzar. My majesty, God speaks, he falls, brain goes, it's over. And now he is, for 7 years, driven from among men, eats grass like an ox, and his body is wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. This is a man who has lost his mind. Nobody can come near him. Do you not think this mighty king, they want to maybe give him some degree of respect, cut his hair, clip his nails, lift him up from the grass, give him somewhere to be? He wouldn't let them. He thinks he's a beast. So many parallels with the losing of the collective mind of society today. But he believed that he was a beast. God has passed judgment, and that was his lot for 7 years. We're going to come to the conclusion now. At the end of days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. That's the inclusio, that's the bookends. We saw that at the beginning of the chapter, we see it again at the end. This is his declaration, that he rises up, he finally recognizes and he gives praise to God, who is the Most High, above all other gods. He honors him, who is the one who lives forever. Why? Because his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures for generation to generation. We dealt with that at the beginning. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. And he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. Here are the lessons he's learned. That when we come to the accounting of power and authority, people count for nothing. People count for nothing. Doesn't matter. What do you want to do, Nebuchadnezzar? Doesn't matter. I'm just a man. They're accounted as nothing, and he, God, does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. God is going to do what he wants to do in your life. I don't care what your plan is for your life. God has a plan for your life, and he will do his plan. And your plan may not be what you want. You may not have the dreams that you wanted, the things that you hoped that you would see in your life. Those of us who are older, where you thought you would be this day, you may not be in that place at all. But God's plans can't be thwarted. I preach this point hard, and I preach this point passionately because I've wasted so many years of my life not recognizing this. God's going to do with our lives what he wants to do. It is not for us to kick against the goad, as the old King James said of Paul at his conversion. But it is for us to bow the knee, because none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" This is hard, and I want you to know that this is a broken person preaching to broken people. There are times in our lives when we go through things and we want to shake our fist at heaven. How could you do that? How could you let that happen to me? How could you let that happen to my family? Why are you doing the things that you're doing? What have you done? No one can say. Now, I want you to understand this in context, friends. This passage is not saying that you have no basis to shake your fist at the heavens and cry out to God. Because there are countless psalms where we are encouraged to do exactly that. And for those of you who are newer here, you may want to go back to the messages on the website and look at the message I preached on the ABCs of lament to understand not just that we have the right to, but just how important it is that we acknowledge our pain before God. We get to say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even though we will ultimately, as we continue on the biblical path of lament, come like the psalmist did to the conclusion that you will raise us up. So we get to cry out to God. What the verse is saying is, you have no basis to do so in and of yourself. You don't get to decide how your life goes. He gets to decide. It's not for you to tell him you shouldn't have done this, because he is sovereign and he is omniscient and he is good, and you are none of those things. You know why you wouldn't have chosen the things in your life that you have? Because you're not as clever as God, and you're not as loving as God. And God can redeem everything. God can redeem the worst of disasters, the greatest of abuses, and use it all for his glory. Absolutely all of it. And I mean that without exception. I have sat in this building and counseled victims of child abuse and told them exactly the same thing. Because there is no solution to be found for the brokenhearted in fleeing from the doctrine of the sovereignty of God. Rather, we must confront it head on and say, though we don't understand now, he does, and he sees, and he will be glorified, and his judgment will be redeemed in our eyes. And how do I know that with such certainty? Because the greatest sin that was ever committed in the history of humanity was the murdering of Jesus Christ. And no single event has brought greater glory and greater good to this earth. Nor will it ever. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom and my majesty and splendor returned to me. There's something in that you have to see. Do you see a repetition from earlier? Anybody spot it? My majesty. What was his last words? My majesty. And what does he get afterwards? My majesty. You're like, what? Wasn't that the problem? No, that wasn't the problem. The problem wasn't the walls. The problem wasn't the palace. The problem wasn't the kingdom. The problem wasn't the wealth. The problem was how great I am rather than how great thou art. And now that he is able to say how great thou art, now we can have some majesty again. There's no easy way to say this. Many of us go through trials and struggles in life because we just won't bow the knee. Stay in Daniel. I just want to read to you a little bit from Job 33, when Elihu shows up at the end. He says this: his soul draws near the pit. This is talking of man. Man's soul draws near to the pit. It's to death. His life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of 1,000, to declare to man what is right for him and merciful to him. And he says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. This is a whole section in Job 33 that talks about rescuing man from death and an angel, a mediator, coming to him. Something that we see in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, because there's an angel that comes to protect the stump. Create the stump, but to protect the stump. But a little earlier in the same passage it says this, verse 12, behold, in this you are not right, I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words? It's interesting that Daniel is talking about who can say to God, why have you done this? And here in Job 33, which we've already had a link to Job previously in Daniel, people contending against God, saying, why won't you answer me, God, essentially? For God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds. And he opens the ears of men, terrifies them with his warnings, that he may turn man aside from his deed and conceal pride from a man. That's powerful. And by the way, that's going to be our main text tonight when we look at this in more depth. In the book of Job, he says this: God can speak through dreams. He can typically warn a man once, warn a man twice, but eventually he'll have to conceal his pride. Nebuchadnezzar was warned. He had every opportunity to know that there was a God. Showing my age here now, but I remember the old DC Talk song that said, some people got to learn the hard way. You know what? When did I hear that? It's probably the 90s, and it resonated with me then. Man, I wish I'd let it resonate a little bit more. I mean, I laugh, but my goodness, I'm crying inside. God is so good. You can't fathom God's goodness. He wants to do so much for us. Give us the best of things. Not material things, necessarily. But he wants to use us for his glory, which is the greatest good of all. And so often, it is our pride that stands in the way. I beg you, every one of you, afresh this day, bow the knee. Bow the knee, account for yourself as but nothing, and bow the knee before the Creator of heaven and earth, the one whose works are all right, his ways are all just. And to those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. He will exalt those who are humble and humble those who exalt themselves. May we bow the knee before him and give him all glory. Amen. Father, I pray this day that each and every one of us will be humble before you. I pray for our rulers. I pray for those who are judges in this area, in this county, in this state. Pray for those in law enforcement. Pray for those who serve in the military. I pray for those who have authority in LA County. Pray for Governor Gavin Newsom. Pray for President Joe Biden. Pray, Lord, that they would humble themselves before you, and that if they don't, that you, being a good and merciful God, would protect them and preserve them and save their souls from hell by making them a stump in some way or other, that they would rise from their humiliation and give glory to you and to you alone. Lord, may we have boldness to proclaim this message to them, to all who lead and have authority, and may that warning that we give them, may it bring fear upon us as well, for each and every one of us who have authority in the home, in the workplace, and elsewhere. And may every one of us know that you are the God who humbles the proud. Lord, may we bow in humility now, that you would have no need to crush us further. But then, Lord, and I pray this with trepidation, knowing full well what this feels like, if you have to chop us down, then chop us down. Only do not let us miss out on the joy and the glory of being used by you. And I pray for those that we love, who know your gospel, who know that you are the Most High, and reject you and don't bow the knee. Lord, turn their hearts, but again, if you have to, chop them down, rather than let their souls go to hell. But in all your decisions, in all that you do, in the way that you do it, to whom that you do it, when you do it, and how you do it, may we acknowledge your authority, and may all glory go to your holy name. Amen.